Hello, dream traveler. I am the storyteller, and I'm here to accompany you as you rest tonight. But before you drift into sleep, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments, where are you listening from right now, and what time is it there? Now take a deep breath, close your eyes, get comfortable, and relax. Let the sound of the rain and tonight's story calm your mind as you slowly drift into sleep. The quiet passenger on the last night bus. The last bus of the night left downtown Denver at exactly 11:40 p.m. For most people, it was just another late ride home after a long day of work. The bus followed a quiet route that slowly left the bright streets of the city and moved toward the darker, quieter outskirts where neighborhoods grew farther apart and streetlights became less frequent. Marcus Hill had been driving that route for almost 7 years. By now, the routine felt automatic. He knew every stop sign, every cracked piece of pavement, every flickering streetlight along the way. Sometimes he joked that he could probably drive the entire route with his eyes closed. Of course, he never would. But the truth was that nothing surprising ever happened on the last bus. Most nights, there were only 4 or 5 passengers. A nurse heading home from the hospital. A college student half asleep with headphones on. Sometimes a tired construction worker staring out the window. Quiet people, quiet rides. Marcus liked it that way. The city slowly faded behind him as the bus rolled through long, empty roads. The gentle hum of the engine and the soft vibration of the tires on asphalt filled the silence inside the vehicle. That night looked like any other. 4 passengers had boarded downtown. Marcus glanced briefly at them through the large mirror above his seat. One woman near the front scrolling on her phone. A young guy asleep with his head against the window. An older man with a grocery bag resting on his lap. And someone sitting in the very last row. Marcus didn't pay much attention to that last passenger. People often chose the back seats, especially when the bus was almost empty. Still, something about that figure felt oddly still. The road grew darker as the bus left the city limits. Tall trees replaced buildings, and long stretches of empty asphalt spread ahead like black rivers under the headlights. Marcus drove with one hand resting lightly on the wheel. He glanced at the mirror again. The woman in the front had gotten off 2 stops ago. Now there were only 3 passengers left. The sleeping student, the older man, and the figure in the last row, still sitting there, still completely motionless. Marcus frowned slightly. He had the strange impression that the person hadn't moved at all since boarding. Not to check a phone, not to stretch, not even to shift position. The bus slowed as it approached another stop. The older man stood up slowly and stepped toward the door. Marcus pressed the brake and opened it with a hiss of compressed air. The man stepped off the bus without saying a word. Now there were only 2 passengers. Marcus watched in the mirror as the doors closed. The student near the middle rows was still asleep, head leaning awkwardly against the glass, and the passenger in the last row still sitting perfectly straight. Marcus couldn't see the person's face clearly. The interior lights were dim, and the back of the bus remained mostly in shadow. But he could see the outline of a long coat and the silhouette of someone sitting upright. 2 upright. The bus pulled away from the stop. Marcus adjusted the mirror slightly, just to see better. But when the angle changed, something strange happened. The back seats were visible. The student was visible. but the very last seat looked empty. Marcus blinked, then adjusted the mirror again, and suddenly the figure was there again, sitting exactly where it had been before. Marcus stared at the mirror for a few seconds longer than usual. His fingers tightened slightly on the steering wheel. That was strange, very strange. He shifted the mirror again. The reflection moved smoothly across the rows of seats. Seat after seat came into view. But when the reflection reached the very last row, there was no one there. Marcus slowly turned his head, just slightly. Not enough to take his eyes fully off the road, but enough to glance behind him. And there, in the back of the bus, the passenger was clearly sitting in the last seat, exactly where he had been the entire time. Marcus felt a small knot tighten in his stomach. He looked back to the mirror. Empty. He looked back down the aisle. The man was still there, sitting perfectly still, facing forward. Marcus let out a quiet breath through his nose. Probably just the angle, he muttered to himself. Mirrors could be tricky. Reflections didn't always show things exactly the way the eye saw them. Still, he adjusted the mirror again, slowly, carefully. The reflection moved. The rows of seats passed through the frame one by one, and then the last row appeared again, empty. Marcus felt the knot in his stomach tighten a little more because when he glanced back down the aisle again, the passenger in the long coat had not moved at all. But now, the head was tilted slightly to the side, as if the man had been watching him the entire time. Marcus tried to convince himself that it was nothing. Mirrors could be strange. Reflections could fail depending on the angle, the light, or even the vibration of the bus. After 7 years driving the night route, he had seen plenty of small visual tricks that came and went in seconds. Still, this one felt different. He kept his eyes on the road, but every few seconds they drifted upward toward the mirror. The student was still there in the middle rows, slumped against the window, breathing slowly in sleep. And in the back of the bus, the passenger remained perfectly still. The long coat hung down around the seat, almost blending with the dark shadows near the rear window. Marcus swallowed and tried to focus on driving. The road ahead stretched into darkness, illuminated only by the wide beam of the bus headlights. Trees lined both sides, their branches forming dark shapes that swayed slightly in the night wind. The next stop was approaching. It was a small one. Hardly anyone used it at this hour. Marcus slowed the bus and pulled gently to the curb. The brakes sighed. The doors opened. For a moment, no one moved. Then the student woke with a sudden jerk, confused for a second before realizing where he was. He stood up quickly, grabbed his backpack, and stumbled toward the exit. Marcus gave him a small nod. The young man stepped off the bus and disappeared into the quiet street. The doors closed again. Now, the bus had only one passenger left. Marcus glanced into the mirror. The man in the back row was still there, still sitting upright, still completely motionless. And suddenly, Marcus realized something strange. He could not remember seeing the man board the bus. The engine hummed softly as the bus continued down the road. Marcus tried to replay the beginning of the route in his mind. 4 passengers had boarded downtown. He remembered the woman. He remembered the student. He remembered the older man with the grocery bag. But the last passenger, he couldn't remember the moment the man stepped onto the bus. Usually Marcus noticed people as they boarded. Even if he didn't look directly at them, there was always a movement, a shadow, the sound of footsteps climbing the stairs. But this time, nothing. Marcus slowly adjusted the rearview mirror again. The back seats came into view. Empty. Completely empty. His chest tightened. He lowered his eyes and looked directly down the aisle. And there he was. The man in the long coat sat in the last seat, exactly as before. Marcus felt the coldest chill he had experienced in years crawl across the back of his neck. For the next few minutes, he said nothing, did nothing. He simply drove. The bus rolled past another stretch of empty road. Houses became rarer, and the spaces between streetlights grew longer. Darkness filled the bus between each pool of yellow light outside. Marcus tried not to look again. But eventually, curiosity got the better of him. He reached toward the small monitor beside the dashboard. Most of the buses had interior cameras installed. They recorded the aisle and passenger area for security. Marcus pressed a button. The screen flickered. Then the camera view appeared. It showed the inside of the bus from the ceiling near the middle rows. Seats, windows, the sleeping student earlier, now gone, and the empty back rows. Marcus leaned forward. He stared at the monitor. The last row of seats was clearly visible in the camera, but no one was sitting there. Marcus felt his mouth go dry. He looked at the screen again, then slowly lifted his eyes from the monitor and looked down the aisle of the bus. The man was still sitting there, exactly where the camera showed an empty seat. Marcus turned back to the monitor, empty, back to the aisle. The passenger remained perfectly still. The long coat, the pale outline of a face barely visible in the dim light. Marcus felt his heart beating harder now. Something was wrong, very wrong. He forced himself to breathe slowly and kept driving. Maybe the camera had malfunctioned. Maybe the lighting was causing a shadow that made the man harder to detect. Maybe. But Marcus knew machines. He had spent years around them, and machines rarely hid things that were physically there. The road curved slightly ahead. Marcus turned the wheel, and the bus followed the bend. The headlights swept across a roadside sign as they passed, and for a brief moment, the light from the sign flashed through the bus windows and illuminated the back seats more brightly than before, just for a second. But it was long enough, because in that flash of light, Marcus saw something that made his entire body freeze. The passenger in the last row wasn't just sitting still. He was sitting there with his head tilted forward, and his eyes were open, wide, unblinking, and staring directly at Marcus through the mirror. But what truly made Marcus's stomach drop was something else, because in that brief flash of brighter light, Marcus realized the man wasn't casting any shadow at all inside the bus. And at that exact moment, a soft sound came from the back. Not a movement, not footsteps, just a quiet whisper that seemed to travel slowly through the empty bus. A voice so faint, Marcus almost thought he imagined it, but he heard it clearly. Next stop. The whisper paused, then finished the sentence in a slow, hollow tone. My stop. Marcus kept his hands firmly on the steering wheel, but he could feel a thin layer of sweat forming on his palms. The road ahead stretched into a long tunnel of darkness, illuminated only by the wide beams of the bus headlights. The engine hummed steadily beneath him, vibrating gently through the floor and up into the steering column. Normally, that sound was comforting, familiar. Tonight, it felt strangely distant. Behind him, the bus was silent. Too silent. Marcus forced himself not to turn around again. His eyes stayed on the road, but his mind kept drifting back to the mirror. to the impossible thing he had just seen. The passenger in the last row, visible with his own eyes, but missing in the mirror, missing on the camera, and now speaking. Marcus swallowed slowly. "Just finish the route," he muttered under his breath. That was the logical thing to do. Drive, reach the final stop, let the passenger get off, then report the strange camera issue to the transit office. Yes, that made sense. But the whisper echoed in his memory. Next stop, my stop. The next stop wasn't for another 10 minutes. It was one of the final stops on the route, near a narrow rural intersection surrounded by empty fields and a few scattered houses. Almost nobody ever used it. Marcus had driven past that stop hundreds of times without anyone getting on or off. The bus rolled forward steadily. The tires hummed against the asphalt. The streetlights grew fewer and farther apart, until eventually the road was lit only by the bus headlights and the pale glow of the dashboard. Marcus finally glanced at the mirror again. The back seats were visible. The passenger was still sitting there, but something had changed. Before, the man had been sitting perfectly upright. Now, his head was tilted slightly forward, not much, just enough that his face was now partially hidden in shadow. Marcus felt a cold pressure settle in his chest, because the man's shoulders were moving. Slowly, very slowly, as if he were breathing. Marcus tried to steady his breathing. His rational mind searched desperately for explanations. Maybe the camera system was malfunctioning. Maybe the mirror angle was creating some strange visual trick. Maybe the man simply looked unsettling because of the lighting. Yes, that had to be it. But another thought crept quietly into his mind. If the man had been sitting there the entire time, why hadn't Marcus heard him move even once? Passengers always shifted in their seats eventually. They checked their phones, they coughed, they stretched their legs. But this passenger had remained completely silent, completely still, for nearly 20 minutes. Marcus looked down at the small monitor again. The camera feed still showed the interior of the bus, rows of empty seats, the dim lights overhead, the last row, still empty. Marcus leaned slightly closer to the screen. The camera was working perfectly. The image was clear. There was no distortion, no flickering, just an empty seat where someone should have been. Marcus slowly lifted his gaze from the monitor and looked down the aisle again. The passenger was still there, but now he was leaning forward slightly. Marcus felt his breath catch in his throat. The man's hands were now resting on the seat in front of him, long fingers gripping the top of the seat, and his head was angled upward now, not downward, upward, looking directly toward the driver. Marcus's heartbeat began to pound louder in his ears. The road ahead curved slightly as the bus approached a long stretch of farmland. Beyond the windows, there was nothing but darkness. No houses, no lights, no other cars. Just the empty road and the whisper of wind against the metal frame of the bus. Marcus looked at the mirror again. The reflection showed the aisle, the seats, and nothing in the last row. But from the corner of his eye, he could still see the passenger sitting there in reality, watching him, waiting. The bus continued down the road for several more minutes. Marcus didn't realize how tightly he was gripping the steering wheel until his fingers began to ache. The silence behind him felt heavier now, almost like the air inside the bus had grown thicker. He checked the time on the dashboard clock. 12:18 a.m. The next stop was approaching. The one the whisper had mentioned. Marcus could already see the intersection ahead. A lonely road crossing the route, marked by a single flickering streetlight and a faded bus stop sign standing beside a gravel shoulder. No houses nearby, no sidewalks, just fields stretching into darkness. Marcus felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He glanced at the mirror again. The reflection showed the empty seats. But when he looked down the aisle, the passenger was no longer sitting in the last row. Marcus's heart skipped. For a split second, he thought the man had disappeared. Then he saw him, standing halfway down the aisle. Marcus had not heard footsteps, not a single one, but the passenger was now standing between the rows of seats, holding lightly onto the top of one of them for balance. The long coat hung straight down around his body, his head tilted slightly to one side. Watching, Marcus's breathing became shallow. He forced himself to keep his eyes on the road. The bus rolled toward the stop sign. The streetlight flickered weakly overhead. Marcus pressed the brake pedal. The bus slowed. The doors hissed open. For a moment, nothing happened. Marcus waited. The open doorway faced the empty road. Cold night air drifted inside the bus. Then slowly, Marcus heard movement behind him. A single step, soft, heavy, then another. He did not turn around. He could feel the presence moving down the aisle, getting closer to the front, closer to the driver's seat, closer to him, and then the footsteps stopped, right behind him. Marcus felt a cold breath brush lightly against the back of his neck. A voice spoke quietly beside his ear, not a whisper this time, a calm, hollow voice. "Thank you for stopping." Marcus slowly turned his head. But when he looked toward the open doors, no one stepped off the bus. The road outside remained completely empty. And when Marcus turned back toward the aisle, the passenger was gone. But something else happened. On the floor of the bus, right beside the front steps, a wet trail of muddy footprints leading from the back row all the way to the open doors. Marcus stayed frozen in the driver's seat for several long seconds. Cold night air continued to drift inside the bus through the open doors, carrying the faint smell of wet soil and distant farmland. Normally, Marcus barely noticed the smells of the road during his shift, but now everything felt sharper, heavier, as if the entire world had suddenly gone quiet just to make him aware of it. But his attention wasn't on the road, it was on the floor, on the muddy footprints. They were clear and unmistakable against the gray rubber flooring of the bus. Dark, wet marks that started near the back row of seats and continued slowly down the aisle, step by step, until they stopped right at the open doorway. Marcus leaned forward slightly. The footprints were the size of a man's shoes, large, heavy. Each step looked slow and deliberate, as if whoever had made them had walked calmly to the front of the bus, and then simply vanished. Marcus swallowed. He leaned sideways in his seat and looked through the open door again. The room outside was completely empty. The weak streetlight flickered above the bus stop sign, casting a pale yellow circle of light onto the gravel shoulder beside the road. Beyond that small patch of light, there was nothing but darkness stretching across the fields. No movement, no person walking away, no car headlights in the distance, just silence. Marcus rubbed his face slowly with both hands. Maybe someone ran off, he muttered under his breath. But even as he said the words, he knew they didn't make sense. If someone had stepped off the bus and run away, the muddy footprints would have continued outside. They would lead away from the door. But they didn't. The last print stopped right at the edge of the step. Marcus exhaled slowly and finally reached forward to press the button that closed the doors. The pneumatic system hissed as the doors folded shut. The cold air disappeared, and the bus became silent again. Marcus looked back down at the floor one more time. The muddy prints were still there, but now something strange was happening, very slowly. They were fading. At first, Marcus thought it was just his imagination. He leaned forward again, squinting at the floor, but there was no doubt about it. The dark, muddy footprints were slowly becoming lighter. The wet shine on the surface of the rubber floor began to dry and dull. The edges of each footprint softened, the shapes becoming less defined with every passing second. Marcus watched in complete silence. His breathing had become slow and shallow without him realizing it. The bus engine idled quietly beneath him. Outside, the wind moved faintly through the fields. Inside the bus, the marks continued to fade. After nearly a minute, the last visible outline of the final footprint disappeared entirely. The floor looked clean, untouched, as if no one had walked there at all. Marcus leaned back in the driver's seat. For a long moment, he simply stared at the empty aisle. Then he forced himself to move. "Finish the route," he whispered to himself. That was the only thing that made sense right now. Finish the route, return the bus to the depot, and report everything in the morning. Marcus placed his hands back on the steering wheel and slowly pulled the bus away from the stop. The headlights stretched across the empty road again as the vehicle rolled forward. The last section of the route was only a few miles long, a quiet road cutting through open farmland before eventually reaching the final stop near a small residential area. Marcus tried to focus only on the road ahead, but after a minute, his eyes drifted toward the small monitor beside the dashboard. The security camera feed still displayed the interior of the bus, rows of seats, dim ceiling lights, the empty aisle, and the last row. Marcus suddenly sat up straighter because now something had appeared on the screen, a shape, a person, sitting in the final seat, perfectly still. Marcus slowly raised his eyes from the monitor and looked down the aisle of the bus. The seats in the back were completely empty. Marcus felt a cold wave move through his chest. He looked back down at the monitor. The figure remained there on the screen, sitting in the last row. The long coat was clearly visible now, darker than the seats around it. The head leaned slightly forward, just like before. Marcus slowly turned his head and looked down the aisle again. Nothing. The back of the bus was empty. Every seat, every shadow, empty. Marcus pulled the bus onto the gravel shoulder and brought it to a stop. The engine idled quietly as he sat there, staring at the monitor. The figure did not move. Marcus finally stood up from the driver's seat. His legs felt stiff as he stepped into the aisle. The bus seemed unusually long as he began walking toward the back. Each step made a faint creaking sound on the floor. The dim overhead lights flickered slightly as the bus engine vibrated. Marcus reached the last row. He stopped. The seat was empty. Marcus let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Then he slowly turned around to walk back toward the front. That was when he noticed the reflection in the rear window. The dark glass acted like a mirror in the night. Marcus could clearly see his own reflection standing in the aisle. But there was something else behind him. Another figure, standing only a few inches away. Marcus felt every muscle in his body lock in place. The reflection showed the man in the long coat, tall, still, his head slightly tilted, watching Marcus. Marcus slowly turned around. The aisle behind him was empty. When he turned back to the window, the reflection was gone. Marcus finished the rest of the route without looking back even once. The next morning, he reported everything to the transit supervisor. The older man listened quietly without interrupting. When Marcus finished speaking, the supervisor opened an old archive file on his computer. There had been an accident on that same road 15 years earlier. A late-night bus had lost control during a storm and crashed into a drainage ditch. Several passengers had died. One of them had been seated in the last row. According to the report, witnesses said that shortly before the crash, the man had asked the driver to stop at that exact rural intersection. But the driver had told him the bus only stopped at official stops further down the route. The supervisor closed the file slowly. Then he looked back at Marcus. "You're not the first driver to mention him," he said quietly. Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. "What does he want?" Marcus asked. The supervisor leaned back in his chair and answered with a tired expression. "Just the same thing every time." He paused, then finished the sentence. "A stop he never got." Now, let's move on to the next story. The Voice That Called, every night at 2:43 a.m. Daniel Carter had lived in the house for exactly 12 days when the first strange thing happened. The place sat alone on the edge of a quiet stretch of desert outside a small Arizona town called Dry Ridge. It wasn't the kind of town most people passed through unless they had a reason to be there. A single gas station, a small grocery store, a diner that closed at 8 every night, and long, empty roads that stretched into endless fields of dry earth and scattered cacti. Daniel had moved there for the silence. After years of working late shifts in Phoenix, surrounded by traffic, noise, and endless crowds, the quiet of Dry Ridge had seemed almost peaceful. The house itself was older than most of the buildings in town. It was a single-story wooden structure with a deep front porch and wide windows that looked out across the desert. The previous owner had moved away suddenly, according to the real estate agent, and the property had stayed empty for nearly a year. Daniel didn't mind that. If anything, the isolation made the place cheaper and quiet. The first 11 nights passed without anything unusual happening. Daniel unpacked his boxes slowly, arranged furniture, and spent his evenings sitting on the porch watching the sun disappear behind the flat desert horizon. But on the 12th night, something woke him. At first, he didn't know why. He simply opened his eyes suddenly in the darkness of his bedroom, feeling the strange sensation that something had interrupted his sleep. The room was completely silent. The digital clock beside his bed glowed faintly in the darkness. 2:43 a.m. Daniel frowned slightly and rubbed his eyes. He listened carefully. Nothing. Just the quiet desert night. He exhaled slowly and turned over, pulling the blanket closer around his shoulders. That was when he heard it. A voice, very faint, calling his name. Daniel. The sound seemed to come from somewhere outside the house. Daniel sat up in bed immediately. For a few seconds, he simply listened. His heart was beating faster now, not from fear exactly, but from confusion. The voice had been quiet, almost like someone speaking from a distance, but he had heard it clearly. Daniel. The voice had sounded calm, not threatening, not urgent, just calling. Daniel swung his legs off the bed and walked slowly toward the bedroom window. The wooden floor creaked softly under his weight as he moved. Outside, the desert night stretched endlessly beneath the pale glow of the moon. The ground was covered with sand, dry grass, and scattered rocks that cast long shadows across the yard. There were no street lights near the house, no other homes close enough to see, just darkness. Daniel leaned slightly closer to the window and scanned the yard. Nothing moved. The wind stirred lightly across the desert, brushing through the dry plants and creating a faint, whispering sound. He waited. 10 seconds, 20, 30. No voice came again. Daniel shook his head slightly. Probably just a dream, he murmured. Sometimes the mind played tricks when someone woke up suddenly. He stepped away from the window and returned to bed. Within a few minutes, he had fallen asleep again. But the next night, at exactly 2:43 a.m., he woke up again, and once more the voice called his name. The third night was when Daniel began to feel uneasy, because by then the pattern was impossible to ignore. He woke up again, exactly at 2:43 a.m. This time his eyes opened before the voice even spoke. He stared at the glowing red numbers on the clock. 2:43. And right on cue, the voice came again. Daniel. This time it sounded closer. Daniel sat up slowly. A cold feeling crept across the back of his neck. He stood and walked toward the window again, but more cautiously now. The desert outside looked exactly the same as it had the previous nights. Empty, still, silent. But as Daniel stared out across the yard, something caught his attention. Near the edge of the property, where the dry sand met a patch of darker soil, he noticed something he was sure hadn't been there before. A small mound of disturbed earth. It looked like someone had dug into the ground. Daniel frowned. He didn't remember seeing that earlier that day. He leaned closer to the glass. The mound wasn't large, but the dirt around it looked freshly turned, as if the ground had been opened recently. Daniel watched the spot for several seconds. Nothing moved. The wind drifted softly across the sand. Then, once again, the voice spoke. But this time, Daniel realized something that made his stomach tighten. The voice wasn't coming from somewhere in the desert. It was coming from the yard, from the direction of the disturbed ground, and it whispered his name again. Daniel. But now it sounded closer than ever. Daniel didn't go back to sleep that night. After hearing the voice again and realizing it seemed to come from the small mound of disturbed earth in his yard, something deep in his mind refused to relax. He stayed sitting on the edge of the bed for a long time, staring at the window. The desert outside remained silent. Occasionally, a weak wind drifted across the sand, pushing small lines of dust across the ground. The moonlight painted the yard in pale gray shadows, making every rock and cactus look like strange figures standing in the distance. But the mound of earth remained exactly where it was, dark, still, waiting. Daniel eventually stood and walked to the kitchen, pouring himself a glass of water. The clock above the stove now read 3:11 a.m. His mind kept replaying the sound of the voice. It hadn't sounded angry or threatening. If anything, it sounded patient, like someone calling for help. But there had been something strange about it too. The tone felt wrong, too quiet, too steady, like someone speaking without breathing. Daniel shook his head and tried to laugh at himself. "You're letting the silence get to you," he muttered. Living alone in the desert could play tricks on anyone. Sounds traveled strangely at night. Voices could echo across long distances. Someone passing on the road might have called out without realizing how clearly it carried through the open desert. Yes, that explanation made sense. Still, when the sun finally rose and the orange light of morning filled the horizon, Daniel walked outside to examine the yard. And when he got closer to the mound of dirt, his stomach tightened because it was definitely fresh. The soil was darker and loose, as if someone had dug there recently, and Daniel was certain he hadn't touched that part of the yard. Daniel crouched down beside the disturbed patch of ground. The desert soil was usually hard and dry, but here it felt softer when he pressed his fingers into it. Someone had dug there not long ago. The loose dirt formed a small mound about 2 feet wide. It wasn't a deep hole anymore. Whoever had disturbed the ground had filled it back in, but the surface was uneven enough that it stood out clearly against the flat desert around it. Daniel looked around the yard. The house stood alone in every direction. The nearest road was nearly half a mile away, and beyond that stretched miles of empty desert. No footprints, no tire tracks, no sign that anyone had visited the property. Daniel stood up slowly. The voice from the night before echoed again in his mind. Daniel, a cold thought passed through him. What if the voice had been coming from under the ground? Daniel immediately dismissed the idea. That was ridiculous. He laughed quietly to himself again, though the sound felt forced. Probably some animal digging, he said aloud. Coyotes sometimes buried food. Other animals could disturb the soil during the night, but even as he said it, he noticed something else. Sticking out from the edge of the mound, just barely visible, something metallic. Daniel leaned closer. A small corner of rusted metal protruded from the dirt. It looked like part of a box. Daniel stared at the metal edge for several seconds. At first he thought it might be an old piece of junk buried in the yard. Out in the desert, people often discarded broken tools, containers, or scrap metal that eventually became buried beneath the sand. But something about this object looked different. The metal surface was rusted, but the shape looked deliberate, flat, straight, like the corner of a container. Daniel stepped back and looked toward the small storage shed behind the house. Inside the shed, he had seen a few old tools left by the previous owner. Among them was a shovel. For a moment, he hesitated. Digging up something buried in the yard of a house you had just moved into wasn't exactly normal behavior. But curiosity was already pulling at him, and the memory of the voice from the night before made it impossible to ignore. 10 minutes later, Daniel returned with the shovel. The desert sun was climbing higher now, warming the ground as he pushed the blade into the loose soil. The dirt came away easily, much easier than the surrounding ground. Whoever had dug here had done it recently. After only a few minutes, the shape beneath the soil became clearer. It wasn't just a small piece of metal. It was an entire box. Old, rust-covered, about the size of a small suitcase. Daniel brushed dirt away from the top until he could see the entire lid. There was a latch on the front and something scratched into the metal surface. At first the marks were hard to read beneath the rust, but as Daniel wiped away more dirt, the letters slowly became visible. They were carved roughly into the metal. One word, a name. Daniel leaned closer to read it, and when he did, his heart suddenly began to pound in his chest, because the name scratched into the lid of the buried box was his own. Daniel. At that exact moment, even though it was the middle of the morning, Daniel heard the voice again. soft, close. And this time, it didn't come from the desert. It came from the box beneath his hands. Daniel jerked his hands away from the metal box as if it had suddenly become hot. For a few seconds, he simply stared at it, frozen in place, trying to understand what he had just heard. The desert around him was bright and quiet under the morning sun. The wind moved slowly across the dry grass, carrying the faint rustling sound of plants brushing against each other. Everything looked completely normal. But Daniel knew what he had heard. The voice had come from the box, soft, clear, and it had spoken his name. He stepped back from the hole he had been digging, his heart beating harder now. A strange pressure had settled in his chest, the kind of feeling that made a person suddenly aware that something was very wrong. For a moment, Daniel considered walking away. He could leave the box there, cover it again with dirt, pretend he had never found it, but the name carved into the lid made that impossible. Daniel, his name, not scratched randomly either. The letters had been carved deliberately deeply into the metal surface, as if whoever had written them wanted the name to last a long time. Daniel leaned closer again. The box was older than the house itself, maybe. Rust covered most of the metal, and the latch had a thick layer of dirt packed into the small opening. Still, the lid appeared to be closed rather than locked. Daniel wiped his hands on his jeans and hesitated for a moment. The voice had come from inside. He was certain of it. But that didn't make sense. Nothing alive could survive buried underground in a sealed metal box. Unless Daniel pushed that thought away immediately. Slowly, he reached forward and grabbed the latch. The metal latch resisted at first. Years of dirt and rust had hardened around the hinge, making it stiff when Daniel tried to lift it. He pulled harder, and the metal scraped with a harsh grinding sound as the latch finally came loose. The noise seemed unusually loud in the quiet desert air. Daniel paused. He listened. Nothing. No voice, no movement from inside the box. Just silence again. He swallowed and slowly lifted the lid. The hinges creaked loudly as the top of the box opened. For a moment, Daniel hesitated before looking inside. Then he forced himself to lean forward. The interior of the box was dark and filled with layers of dust. But there was something inside. Several objects, carefully placed. The first thing Daniel noticed was an old photograph. He picked it up slowly and brushed away the dirt covering the surface. The photo showed the house, the very same house he had just moved into. But the picture looked old, much older than the condition of the building now. The paint on the walls was faded in the photo, and the wooden porch newly built. A man stood in front of the house, tall, thin, wearing clothes that looked like they came from decades ago. Daniel studied the man's face. Something about it made his stomach tighten, because the man in the photograph looked almost exactly like him. Not identical, but close enough that the resemblance was impossible to ignore. The same shape of the jaw, the same eyes, the same narrow nose. Daniel slowly placed the photograph back into the box. Underneath it lay several folded newspaper clippings. Daniel unfolded the first newspaper clipping carefully. The paper was yellow and fragile with age, and the ink had faded slightly. But the headline was still readable. Local man missing near Dry Ridge. Search underway. The article described a man named Daniel Harper, who had disappeared from his home outside Dry Ridge nearly 30 years earlier. According to the report, neighbors had last seen him working in his yard late one evening. When he failed to appear the following day, the local sheriff organized a search of the surrounding desert. They found nothing. No footprints, no vehicle, no signs of a struggle. The man had simply vanished. Daniel's hands felt cold as he read further. The article included a photograph. The same man from the picture he had just found in the box. The resemblance between them now seemed even more disturbing. Daniel opened the second newspaper clipping. This one had a different headline. Police investigate strange reports from abandoned house. The article mentioned several people who had briefly rented the property after the disappearance of Daniel Harper. Most had left within weeks. Some reported hearing strange sounds at night. Others claimed they heard someone calling their name outside the house. But the final paragraph made Daniel's chest tighten. One tenant had reported hearing a voice calling specifically for Daniel. At the time, the police assumed it was a coincidence. Daniel lowered the newspaper slowly. His eyes drifted back toward the open metal box. Inside, beneath the clippings, there was one final object. A small audio recorder, the kind used for recording interviews. Daniel picked it up. The plastic surface was cracked, but the device looked intact. There was a small button on the side labeled Play. Daniel hesitated. The desert wind brushed softly across the yard behind him. Then he pressed the button. The recorder clicked. Static filled the speaker for a moment. Then a man's voice began speaking, a voice that sounded eerily familiar. And the first words the recording said were, "I don't know who will find this, but if your name is Daniel, you need to listen carefully." The small recorder crackled softly in Daniel's hand. For a few seconds, there was nothing but faint static coming from the speaker, the kind of low hiss produced by old tape recordings. The desert wind moved quietly across the yard while Daniel stood beside the open hole, listening with his full attention. Then the man's voice returned, calm, slow, and unmistakably real. "If your name is Daniel," the voice said, "then you're probably standing in the yard of this house right now, holding this recorder." Daniel felt a chill move across his back. The voice sounded older, tired, like someone who had been awake for too many nights in a row. "My name is Daniel Harper," the recording continued, "and if you're hearing this, it means the house chose you too." Daniel's fingers tightened around the recorder. The wind picked up slightly, brushing across the sand and dry grass around the yard. The voice continued, "I don't know why it happens," Harper said. "I've tried to understand it for months, but the house, the land, something here repeats the same pattern." Daniel slowly sat down on the edge of the hole he had dug. His heart was beating harder now. "Every few years, someone named Daniel ends up living here," the voice said. "And when that happens, the voice begins." Daniel's throat felt dry. He remembered the nights. 2:43 a.m. The whisper outside his window, calling his name. Harper's voice continued through the speaker. "At first, you'll hear it outside. Then it gets closer every night. Closer to the house, closer to the door." Daniel glanced instinctively toward the porch. The front door of the house stood closed, the windows reflecting the bright desert sky. The recording crackled again. "And if you stay long enough," Harper said quietly, "eventually it comes inside." These were the 2 bedtime stories for tonight. I hope you enjoyed them. Have a peaceful night. May God watch over you as you sleep. And I'll see you in the next video.